For centuries, scholars, religious people, and the curious have read the first verse of the Bible as an absolute starting point. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This well-known phrase seems to seal the beginning of all things, as if history began there, in an absolute void, in a previous total absence. But there is something curious. The second verse does not show a newly formed universe in perfection, but rather a formless, empty earth covered by darkness and deep waters. What kind of creation begins shrouded in darkness and chaos? And more importantly, why is there no explanation of what came before this desolate scene? This omission did not go unnoticed by ancient thinkers. For a long time, different religious and mystical traditions speculated that the Genesis narrative does not begin exactly at the beginning, but rather from a resumption. What if the text we know is merely the record of a reconstruction? What if something happened before, something big enough to be erased from history, hidden on purpose? This idea is not a modern invention. In ancient Jewish records and mystical texts preserved for generations, there are references to a previous cycle of existence, a time before time, a spiritual reality that would have collapsed for reasons that still generate debate today. Fragments of this possible forgotten past appear in works such as the Book of Enoch, the Zohar, and other texts considered marginal or esoteric, but which have withstood the test of time as if they were silent witnesses to a history even older than that presented in the conventional Bible. It is not about questioning faith or discrediting the sacred text. It is about observing what is before our eyes and which, for some reason, has been ignored or silenced. This is the case with the Hebrew expression used in Genesis. The word Bereshit, often translated as "in the beginning," can also be interpreted as "with wisdom" or "through wisdom." This suggests that perhaps there is something deeper hidden in the first few letters, a layer of meaning that escapes literal reading. This type of enigma has attracted the attention of Kabbalists, rabbis, and mystics over the centuries, not as gratuitous speculation, but as a sincere attempt to understand why a perfect God would begin his work in an imperfect state. If God is order, why does creation begin in chaos? If he is light, why does the world emerge shrouded in darkness? Conventional answers have not always satisfied those who sought more than a simple explanation. And so theories, interpretations, and even spiritual movements have been born that defend the existence of a prior beginning, now absent from the official narrative. This lost beginning, according to some traditions, was not forgotten by accident. It was intentionally removed, perhaps to protect readers, perhaps to avoid heresy, or even to preserve a theological order that depended on the linearity of creation. Ancient religious leaders, especially the elders of Israel, would have had access to profound spiritual revelations and decided that certain knowledge was not ready to be shared with the people. This choice is echoed in several traditions that mention hidden books, sealed chapters, sealed truths. The Book of the Wars of the Lord, the Book of the Righteous, and others mentioned in the Bible itself disappear without a trace. What was in them? Why were they mentioned and never found again? Over time, fragments have survived, some in uncanonized texts, others in oral traditions, and still others disguised as symbols. And as we examine these clues, a new narrative begins to emerge. A narrative that does not contradict Genesis, but rather seems to precede it. It speaks of spiritual realities that preceded the material world, of beings created before humanity, of celestial conflicts that left deep scars, and that perhaps explain why the earth appears as a scene of devastation in the second verse of the Bible. What else might be hidden in the blank spaces of the sacred text? What if the creation we know is just the second chapter of a larger story? These questions are not mere provocations. They carry the weight of millennia of reflection, of searching for meaning, of the desire to understand not only how the world began, but why it began the way it did. Truth, as the ancient mystics assert, is not always in what is seen, but in what has been left silent. The text that is omitted often says more than what is written, and perhaps what was removed from the beginning was not lost, but kept, waiting for the right time to be understood. Because not all revelation happens at once. Some can only be absorbed by those who are prepared to delve deep into what has been hidden from the beginning. When one looks closely at the way the Genesis narrative begins, a curious impression remains. The universe already exists to some degree, but it is plunged into chaos. darkness covers the abyss, and a spirit hovers over the waters. This suggests an action that does not begin from scratch, but from a previous condition that has been modified. This initial image has intrigued scholars for centuries, leading many to consider that we are not faced with an absolute beginning, but rather with continuity. As if the creation described in the Bible were not the first, but a new attempt, the result of something previous that was interrupted, deformed, or simply erased from the known narrative. This hypothesis has gained traction in Jewish schools of thought and among scholars of Hebrew mysticism, especially those who have studied the original Hebrew text. In these studies, it is clear that some word choices carry deeper meanings. The expression, "the earth was formless and void" in the original Vabohu sign appears elsewhere in Scripture, such as in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, where it describes the earth after a judgment. This indicates that the term may not be depicting an initial state of creation, but a condition following some kind of ruin. This line of thinking led to the formulation of the so-called lost chapter theory, a hypothesis that proposes the existence of a narrative prior to the opening verse of Genesis. This theory did not arise in the modern world, nor is it the invention of unfounded speculative minds. On the contrary, it dates back to antiquity and is supported by oral traditions, rabbinic commentaries, and ancient writings that refer to events that occurred before the physical creation of the world as we know it. A significant example is in the traditions of Book of Enoch, a text of Jewish origin whose most complete version survives in Ethiopian manuscripts dated around the 5th century. Although this book was not included in the official Jewish canon, it was widely read and respected among Second Temple Jews, especially in the centuries before the birth of Jesus. It describes spiritual events involving celestial beings created before man, many of whom transgressed the limits established by God. The book suggests that there was a spiritual structure already in existence and organized before the creation of the physical world. These beings, by breaking their function, triggered consequences that affected not only their own order, but also the design of the material creation that would come later. This type of narrative also appears in other sources of Jewish mystical literature. The Zohar, one of the central texts of Kabbalah, written in the Middle Ages but based on much older traditions, also mentions a state prior to the visible creation. It speaks of worlds that were formed and destroyed before the present one, a notion that connects directly to the concept of the existence of a spiritual creation that failed before the physical creation began. The concept known as Shevirat HaKelim, or the breaking of the vessels, is a central piece of this view. According to this doctrine, the divine light, when trying to fill spiritual containers created to contain its essence, ended up breaking them due to the intensity of its purity. These vessels could not withstand the energy they received and broke, scattering fragments of this light throughout the universe. This dispersion caused a state of spiritual imbalance that would require a recreation. Physical creation, therefore, would be the attempt to repair this original collapse. This idea was extensively developed by Isaac Luria in the 16th century, one of the greatest names in Jewish mysticism, who lived in Saft in the north of Galilee. Luria did not invent the doctrine, but he organized and deepened its implications, basing his interpretations on passages from the Torah and ancient mystical texts. This is not just a religious theory. When we look at other ancient creation myths, the same structure is repeated. In the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, for example, the world is born after a conflict between deities and the destruction of one of the primordial beings. In Egypt, similar accounts speak of cycles of destruction and reconstruction that precede the emergence of order. These patterns present in civilizations that had no direct contact with each other raise the possibility that they are reflecting echoes of an older common memory recorded in symbolic form and adapted to their cultures. This point is essential to understanding why so many scholars believe that the beginning of Genesis, as we have it today, is not the account of the entire origin, but of a resumption. There is a background that remains hidden, but whose presence can be felt in the details, the gaps, and the silences. The absence of context for the chaotic condition of verse 2, the lack of explanation for the origin of the deep waters, and the presence of a spirit already hovering over something that already existed all point to an earlier narrative that has been erased, sealed, or simply kept out of reach of the general reader. Over the centuries, this understanding has been preserved by select circles, by scholars and spiritual teachers who saw in these gaps a key to understanding not only the past, but also the nature of present-day reality. They believed that the world we live in bears the traces of a previous spiritual collapse, and that the creative act described in the Torah is in fact a process of restoration. A divine effort to reorganize what had been fragmented, to bring back into order what had been lost in the chaos. This view does not deny creation. On the contrary, it expands its meaning. Seeing Genesis as a new beginning rather than an absolute beginning changes the way we understand the role of humanity, the nature of evil, and even the purpose of existence. Creation ceases to be merely a starting point and becomes an ongoing movement, a divine response to a previous drama that remains veiled but deeply present between the lines of the sacred text. The understanding that Genesis may be the resumption of an earlier project inevitably leads to an even deeper question. What could have happened before? What event or sequence of events could have led to such a desolate condition as we find in the very first words of the biblical text? To find clues about this supposed original rupture, we must look at a recurring theme in the oldest traditions of Jewish thought, the existence of spiritual beings prior to man and the tension that formed between them. Many of these traditions speak of the creation of luminous entities formed of pure essence, whose function was to contemplate the divine presence and participate in the spiritual structure of the cosmos. They were creatures of wisdom, consciousness, and purpose, not exactly angels in the classical sense, but beings whose role was to maintain the harmony of the celestial order. These entities, called primordial in some texts, were not subject to matter. Their existence was linked to the dimension of the spirit and to the light that emanated directly from the divine source. If you like what you're hearing so far, write Amen in the comments. That way, I know you're following along and that this message is making sense to you. The narrative that emerges from works such as the Book of Enoch and parts of the Zohar describes that there were disagreements among these creatures. Some of them resisted the idea of an inferior creation made of material elements and inhabited by limited beings. According to this perspective, the plan to create beings endowed with will, capable of choosing, was a source of tension between those who wished to remain in the stability of spiritual perfection and those who accepted the risk of freedom. It was this disagreement that would have triggered the first conflict on the invisible plane, a rupture that, although not directly recorded in the canonical scriptures, echoes in traditions preserved over millennia. This rebellion is not portrayed as a war in the human mold, but as a breaking of an alliance, a refusal to participate in a divine project that foresaw the existence of an imperfect world where good and evil could coexist. Those who opposed were not evil in essence, but they did not accept the terms of creation. From this gesture of refusal, a process of fall began, not necessarily a physical fall, but a distancing from the original light, a distancing from the full presence that sustained order. Several ancient commentators associate this fall with a disharmony that was reflected not only in the spiritual world, but also in the structure of the visible universe. Physical creation, therefore, would arise not as the product of a smooth sequence of divine actions, but as a response to this imbalance. For this reason, the chaotic waters, the absence of form, and the darkness can be interpreted as marks of a previous collapse, a sign that something had already broken down before the first word of Genesis was pronounced. This tension between obedience and autonomy is present in different religious traditions. In early Christianity, for example, many texts from the first centuries speak of a fall of the angels before the creation of man. Among the oldest rabbis, there are mentions of discussions in heaven about the creation of the human being, as if there were a council where this decision was intensely debated. In some interpretations of the Midrash, this council would have divided the celestial beings. Some of them supported the creation of a free creature, and others feared the consequences of giving so much power to beings who could choose to do wrong. The concept of free will emerges in this context as a central point. The creation of a being with the ability to decide between opposing paths represented a risk that had never been taken before. Previous beings, although conscious and powerful, had not been formed with the same type of freedom. They were expressions of divine will, but not autonomous instruments of transformation. When the decision to create the human being was made, something new was introduced into the cosmic balance, the possibility of voluntary failure. This decision created a fracture, not only in the spiritual hierarchy, but in the very flow of divine light. According to Kabbalah interpretations, this moment marked the beginning of a forced realignment of creation. The space that had previously been fully inhabited by the divine presence began to contain regions of shadow, spiritual territories where God's will did not automatically prevail. It was into this space that the fragments of the shattered light began to spread, and where physical reality began to take shape. This conception is echoed in accounts in the Book of Enoch, where some celestial beings descend to the lower regions and begin to act on their own, interfering in the course of creation and teaching people knowledge considered premature. Among this knowledge were arts, techniques, and practices that accelerated human development, but also diverted the original purpose of existence. These episodes, although not recorded in the canonical books, were widely discussed in Jewish communities during the Second Temple period. This type of rebellion actually represents the rejection of a model that demands responsibility in the face of freedom. Creating a universe where choices matter means accepting that not everything will always be under immediate control. And this is precisely the scenario we find at the beginning of Genesis, a world waiting for order with traces of an unmentioned past, where divine action does not begin from nothing, but on a basis already marked by discontinuity. Understanding this background not only broadens the scope of the biblical narrative, but also offers a new starting point for understanding the role of human beings. If the current creation is the consequence of a previous spiritual disagreement, then the very emergence of humanity carries with it an implicit call to restore the lost balance, to continue an interrupted plan, to actively participate in the reorganization of the wounded reality. Genesis, therefore, ceases to be just an origin story, becoming the chronicle of a carefully planned restart to repair what was broken between the beings that came before. The idea of a creation that preceded the visible creation, marked by a spiritual rupture, has not been completely forgotten. Although the official text of Genesis offers no explanations for events that may have preceded the chaos described at the beginning, different traditions have preserved fragments of a veiled past. These records appear not as linear narratives, but as allusions, symbolic codes, and scattered comments over generations. They are loose pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, point to the existence of a story older than the one usually told. Many of these fragments are found in so-called mystical or apocryphal texts, produced in contexts in which spiritual revelation was treated with extreme care. Sefer Yetzirah, for example, considered one of the oldest Kabbalistic treatises, speaks of creation not only as a physical act, but as a process based on letters, sounds, and immaterial principles. It describes the formation of the universe from combinations of spiritual forces, suggesting that the material world is the reflection of something deeper and earlier. Already in Zohar, one of the pillars of medieval Jewish mysticism, there are mentions of cycles of creation and destruction that precede the emergence of the current world. The text states that before this universe was established, other worlds were created and, because they could not withstand the divine presence, they ended up destroyed. The language used is not direct, but symbolic, and requires careful reading to realize that it preserves the memory of previous attempts to organize existence. These failed attempts would have left traces in the spiritual plane, and the echoes of these failures still resonate in the fabric of reality. Other traditions mention books that are now absent from accepted scripture. Among them are the Book of the Wars of the Lord, the Book of the Righteous, and other titles mentioned directly in the Bible itself, but which have never been found in modern collections. The mere fact that they were mentioned is enough to suggest that there was a wider body of ancient records, possibly containing content considered too sensitive to remain accessible to the general public. In the mystical schools, access to this information was carefully controlled. It was believed that certain knowledge could not be understood outside of a context of spiritual preparation. Many writings state that knowledge revealed prematurely could lead to confusion, pride, or even deviation from the truth. Therefore, it is not surprising that the most controversial content was veiled, encrypted, or attributed only to figures considered spiritually capable, such as Enoch, Moses, or the great prophets. In the case of Enoch, his figure goes beyond the limits of the canonical Genesis. Although the book mentions him briefly, stating that he walked with God and was no longer among men, the apocryphal texts dedicate dozens of chapters to his story. Enoch would have received detailed visions about the functioning of the celestial spheres, the cycles of time, and the fall of spiritual beings that interfered with the balance of creation. These accounts describe organized structures on the invisible plane, with their own hierarchies, functions, and laws. And they also reveal the moment when part of these orders became corrupt. These records are not isolated. In different cultures, there are similar versions of an order before humanity that ended in conflict or collapse. In Mesopotamian myths, such as the Enuma Elish, a war between deities results in the formation of the world from the remains of a destroyed being. In Egyptian thought, there are cycles of creation, destruction, and renewal, reflecting the idea that the stability of the universe is the result of a constant effort to contain the primordial chaos. These similarities between distinct cultures are no coincidence. They indicate that the theme of the pre-fall of man was not just an isolated speculation, but part of an ancestral knowledge that somehow survived time and borders. This persistence raises the possibility that certain symbols, ideas, and images are actually traces of a shared memory about a lost creation. When these elements are placed side by side with the biblical text, we realize that the silences of Genesis are not voids, but intentional spaces. Spaces where revelation was not denied, but postponed, perhaps waiting for a time when spiritual maturity would allow us to rediscover what was hidden. In this sense, the fragments preserved in mystical traditions are not just esoteric curiosities. They are keys that open forgotten passages in the history of creation, offering a broader vision of what came before and why the world, even though it is a divine work, bears so many marks of disorder right from its beginning. If the visible universe is, in fact, the result of a restoration initiated after a breakdown in the spiritual plane, then the human presence in this scenario takes on new contours. The narrative of the creation of man ceases to be merely the presentation of a new creature and begins to represent a milestone in the divine attempt to restore the lost balance. In this context, human beings were not created merely to inhabit a garden, but to actively cooperate in a project of spiritual reconstruction that began long before their emergence. This understanding changes the way we view human responsibility. It is not just about obeying commandments or maintaining moral order, but about participating in a broader process that involves hidden dimensions. Humanity, when inserted into a reality still marked by traces of the previous chaos, receives a double function: to care for what has been restored and to contribute to the ongoing repair of what remains out of balance. It is at this point that the concept of tikkun olam enters as one of the pillars of the Jewish mystical tradition. Tikkun olam, which can be translated as repairing the world or restoring order, does not refer only to social or ethical actions on the earthly plane. In Kabbalah, this principle carries profound spiritual implications. It is based on the idea that fragments of divine light were dispersed at the moment of the initial rupture and became trapped in aspects of creation. These fragments, called sparks, would be scattered throughout physical reality and could be rescued through conscious actions, correct choices, and intentions aligned with the higher will. Every human act, no matter how small it may seem, begins to have spiritual weight. Choosing good, acting justly, seeking the truth, all of these become tools for restoring the invisible order. In this understanding, man is not just a creature, he is an agent of healing, and his mission is not optional but essential for creation to reach its fullness. Isaac Luria, one of the main thinkers of Kabbalah in the 16th century, taught that human beings were placed in the world precisely because they carry within themselves the capacity to reach regions where previous beings failed. Not because they are superior, but because they were shaped with the awareness of error and the possibility of choice. This call for reparation is also reflected in the way tradition deals with the figure of Adam. In the biblical text, his fall is interpreted by many as humanity's first great error. However, in light of this broader perspective, Adam was not simply responsible for a moral lapse. He was inserted into a field of tension that already existed before him. His failure, therefore, does not inaugurate disorder, but reveals that the battle for harmony was still ongoing. The Hebrew termen, which designates the earth from which Adam was formed, is related to red, blood, and also to the idea of substance. This reinforces the notion that man carries in his own constitution the memory of the previous creation and the mission to restore what was lost. His connection with the earth is not only physical, but symbolic. He was made from the place that holds the echoes of the rupture and is called to redeem this space. This mission also appears in a veiled way at various points in the biblical text. When he is tasked with naming the animals, caring for the garden and guarding Eden, the first man is not only exercising authority, but also being taught to discern, organize, and protect. These seemingly simple tasks carry a spiritual meaning, identifying what needs to be restored and acting in favor of reconciliation between the worlds. Over the generations, this responsibility has been transmitted, transformed, and reinterpreted, but never annulled. In rabbinic traditions, the idea that the world depends on the righteousness of its inhabitants is recurrent. A single righteous man, say some ancient sages, can sustain the universe. This refers not only to maintaining social well-being, but to balancing the forces that sustain all creation. The just man is he who, by acting in harmony with superior principles, manages to release the sparks of light and advance in the repair of the world. Understanding the human role from this point of view requires a change in perspective. It is no longer a question of asking what the meaning of life is, but of realizing that existence itself is a response to a previous failure. Being alive in this world is already a sign that you are part of the healing process, and this healing does not happen through spectacular miracles, but through continuous gestures, conscious decisions, and connections with that which transcends. In this way, man becomes a bridge. He connects what was to what can be. He carries within himself the mark of a fall that he did not witness, but also the power to repair what was fragmented. His journey, therefore, is not only a journey of discovery, but of reconstruction, a silent, patient, but absolutely necessary spiritual work for creation to become whole again. Along this journey, we have seen that the creation described at the beginning of the Bible may not be the absolute starting point, but the restart of something much older, deeper, and spiritually complex. If the marks of a previous order are present between the lines, in the silences of the text, and in the fragments preserved by mystical traditions, then the world we know carries with it the memory of something that came before and was, in some way, broken. Man's mission in this broader scenario is not accidental. He is called to occupy the space left by a structure that has failed, but his function goes beyond existing or surviving. The very essence of man is linked to the responsibility of reordering what has been scattered, of reuniting the fragmented parts of creation and actively contributing to the full manifestation of the divine presence once again. This calling is not imposed by force, but revealed by conscience. Each person, by living with intention, by seeking justice, by cultivating good, participates in something that transcends his or her own history. The world as it is not static. It is the result of ancient processes, of decisions made long before the time we know, and of choices that are still being made now. The Bible, in this context, does not confine itself to what it reveals. It invites us to seek out what remains hidden. What has not been said clearly also communicates. What has not been preserved in official books may be recorded in other forms, waiting to be rediscovered with maturity and responsibility. It is not a question of seeking secrets out of vanity, but of recognizing that there are more layers to reality than what is visible. If there is indeed a missing chapter at the beginning of everything, perhaps it was silenced to protect, to prepare, or simply to teach that not all truth is revealed at once. But the signs are there, scattered like traces left by something that still pulses deep within creation. And perhaps the greatest revelation is not in finding this chapter, but in realizing that it has always been there, waiting to be read, not with the eyes, but with the understanding. The beginning that seemed lost may be closer than you think, not in new pages, but in the way we read the ones we already have. And by recognizing this, each person is invited to become part of the continuity of this story, not as a spectator, but as someone who participates, restores, and transforms. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.